Everybody, today we are jumping into Unit 7, Day 11, and we're going to be talking a little bit about minorities during World War II, not just here at home, but also abroad, and what things were like for minorities as they went through World War II. So you're going to see, as far as minority treatment during wartime, especially during World War II, you're going to see that the treatment overseas and their participation overseas often reflected the social conditions here at home. So you have segregation here at home. You're going to have segregation in the military as well. So there is a lot of mirroring between the two sides and what exactly is happening. Despite that, though, minorities would be able to play a very important role in the Allied victory during the war. And we'll talk about that in very specific ways, how they were able to help out. The New Deal, you see, also helped immigrants feel more included, serving together as a band of brothers. And that's not going to just help with immigrants, but that's going to help with all groups as well. And you're going to see that Americans, in a lot of ways, come together during this, especially in the armed forces, to be like this band of brothers. And in a lot of ways, when you're serving beside someone as a brother, it's going to soften your heart, and you're going to start to feel more inclined to, their view on things, and realize, they're just a human being. It's not black and white. We're both human beings. We're both Americans in that. So you're going to see that as well develop within immigrant groups, especially during World War II. So how do minorities participate? Generally, you're going to see minorities serve in segregated military units, and were usually given non-combat roles. Now, as time went on, they did get some combat roles, but usually minorities were not in those direct combat roles. Minorities, though, did demand the right to be able to serve in combat rather than support roles. That didn't really happen all the time. But despite that, there were some examples where they were able to do so. One of the famous examples, Dory Miller, who is pictured here in this propaganda, he helped on Pearl Harbor. He worked on one of the ships there, and famously, he went up and manned a gun and was able to shoot down at least one plane that I know of during that. And for that, he was given the Navy Cross, which is a very high honor within the Navy there. So African Americans during the war, you're going to see over 1.5 African Americans left the South to move north and west for jobs. Again, continuing to talk about that great migration that was happening. 1 million African Americans would serve in the military, and you're going to see, even though they served in the military, discrimination and segregation would still continue. You would see here back in the States, in New York City and Detroit, you would have race riots happen in the summer of 1943. So here at home, you were seeing work, though, towards equality and pushing for equality. NAACP membership increased. Also, you had the Congress on Racial Equality formed to help protect African American interests. President Roosevelt, during this time, he would sign an executive order which prohibited discrimination in government and businesses that received federal aid. And we had talked about how Eleanor was a big one in pushing FDR towards doing that, and he eventually did those. So you're going to see some steps in the right direction occurring here. Now, civil rights leaders, they used what was known as the Double V campaign. And basically, you can see there, it meant victory at home and victory abroad. So they were fighting for freedom abroad, but also fighting for victory and freedom and equal treatment here at home. So that's going to be a big thing for African Americans during that. So probably the most famous example of African Americans during World War II would be the Tuskegee Airmen. The Airmen would be the first African American military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. And basically what their job was as a protective unit, basically, is what they would do is help protect bombers that were flying into Germany. We talked about all the daytime bombing that was happening. Because of that, you needed fighter pilots up there with you to help protect those bombers. Now, they would serve with a very, very high distinction. As a crew, they would earn more than 150 distinguished flying crosses, which was amazing. You can see the numbers there on how many German planes and cars and transport vehicles and that kind of thing that they destroyed. So they do become a very well-respected group within the military, even though at the beginning, people kind of scoffed at the idea of an African-American flying a plane, but they showed that they were more than capable. And if you think about it, in African-Americans' eyes during this time, that one of the only ways that you would really get a lot of respect from people is if you proved yourself in a way like this. And so a lot of the African Americans fighting within the Tuskegee Airmen, they saw this as their opportunity to prove their worth and their value to people that looked down on them. I did put in there the Red Tails movie trailer. That movie came out several years ago. I encourage you to check that movie out. Kind of tells the story of the Red Tails and what they were able to accomplish over in Europe. Now, Japanese Americans. See, with Japanese Americans, it's kind of a mixed bag. 20,000 Japanese Americans would serve in the military, but you're going to see that probably the biggest thing that would happen to Japanese American is the discrimination that they would face here at home. After Pearl Harbor, you're going to have a huge fear that there were Japanese spies here in the United States, and that would lead to the internment of 100,000 Japanese Americans. Again, we're going to talk in more detail about what that looked like there. But you do have Japanese Americans. Again, there's 20,000 that served in the military. Generally, they served over in the European front of the war, and they were organized into what was known as Nisei regiments. They also earned a high number of decorations in Europe, specifically in a couple battles there. They served very valiantly and honorably. And you will see right here, I'm trying to remember the number of it. 442nd Regiment was probably the most famous of the Nisei regiments for their actions over in Europe. All right, so what did internment of Japanese Americans, what exactly did that mean? Well, if you look up the dictionary definition of it, it says the act of confining, especially during wartime. And again, we said 100,000, 110,000 Japanese Americans were placed in these internment camps during World War II. And yes, most of them were people of Japanese ancestry that had actually been born here in the United States. You can see here on the map these relocation facilities that they were put in. A lot of people kind of say like they're like concentration camps. They weren't really concentration camps. You could kind of say they were almost more like prison camps, you could say. The people weren't treated terribly. They had freedom to move around within the camp however they wanted to. But yeah, it was kind of like they were in prison. Now, they weren't being, massacred and slaughtered, which is why I don't like the terminology of a concentration camp for it, because that's not what was happening. But still, it was like they were in prison during this. George Takei, I encourage you to watch this. You don't have to write down questions while you watch that. But George Takei, who was in Star Trek, you're probably familiar with him as an older man. He tweets a lot and does a lot of like humorous type tweets. He actually did a TED Talk talking about his time in his internment as a child. He was a child during World War II and was put in an internment camp, and talked about what exactly that meant for his family and the results of internment for his family, like what they came back to after that. So I encourage you to check out that TED Talk. So why were people put there? Again, we talked about through history that a lot of people on the West Coast had very suspicious feelings about Asian Americans coming in, and a lot of people just didn't like Asian Americans coming in. So you already had this strong anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast, and because of that, that is going to lead them to be more likely to be discriminated against this time, especially after Pearl Harbor and being attacked by Japan. There was also the false belief that Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy. There has been very little evidence of that actually happening, but again, people believed that it was happening. So who did it affect? Of course, Japanese Americans. You're going to see that the Supreme Court would actually uphold the government's right in Korematsu versus the United States. And the Supreme Court said that it was okay for the U.S. government to do this to these people during World War II. Now, later on, the Supreme Court would go back on that decision. But again, this is a very poor decision by the Supreme Court, basically violating these people's rights to due process because they were being thrown in prison and being held indefinitely. So what was the result of internment? Eventually, in 1988, under President Ronald Reagan, you would have the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 passed. There would be an official apology from President Reagan, and they would pay internees, evacuees, and persons of Japanese ancestry that lost property or their freedom during World War II. They paid $20,000 per person to each of those people for what they went to during World War II. So again, I'm sure that helped a little bit, but still not going to help a ton, losing, up to 5 years of your life being in prison for not doing anything wrong except for being a Japanese American. All right. So Mexican Americans, you have 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the military. You're going to see Mexican Americans were not forced to serve in segregated units. They got to serve alongside whites within the military. Also here in the U.S., you're going to see the start of the Bracero program in 1942, which allowed certain Mexican farmers, braceros, and others to enter the U.S. during harvest season without going through the formal immigration procedures. Partly that was done because of a shortage of manpower here in the United States because of the war going on. So this Bracero program was set up to allow these people to come into the United States and to work. Now, famously, you're going to have what was known as the Zoot Suit Riot in 1943. This would be a race riot in Los Angeles between whites, many of these whites in the military, and Mexican Americans. Basically, what a zoot suit was, it was a suit that they wore that was kind of long. It came, like the suit coat came down to like your knees, and it had more baggy pants to it. And a lot of people viewed these zoot suits as unpatriotic because during this time, again, the United States is doing rationing and trying to, basically eliminate excess from people's lifestyles so that could go to the military and towards the war effort. So because of that, Mexicans and others wearing zoot suits were attacked. Many people saw them as unpatriotic, and basically what they did is attack them and would, rip the zoot suit off of them and that kind of thing. Now, nobody was officially killed with this riot. There were people injured as a result of that, but that shows some of the tension that you see there in Southern California between whites and Mexicans in that area. Now, Indians also participated in the war effort. You'd have 25,000 Indians would serve in the military. Most famously, you'd have the Navajo Code Talkers. And the reason they were so important is because the Navajo language to this point had never been written down. It was completely a spoken language, which meant that if you were talking to someone in code through that it would be very, very difficult to be able to decipher that. And that is why the United States military used the Navajo language and used these code talkers, as they were known, to be able to talk between units in the Pacific and that kind of thing. And basically, the Navajo code, it was impossible for the Japanese to be able to break. And that's one of the things I didn't really talk about during World War II is how the different sides tried a lot to be able to break the secret codes that they were sharing between each other. And this Navajo code was one that was impossible to break. So usually you did have a couple Navajo Indians that would travel, especially with Marine units in the Pacific over there, to be able to pass codes between different regiments and different units and that kind of thing. They also have a movie about this one. I think it's called Wind Talkers that had Nicolas Cage in it. I've never seen it, so I can't recommend it, but there is a movie about the code talkers as well. So the impact of these military units, again, they often suffered high casualties, but they did win numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery. There's just some examples there of some military medals that you might see during this time. But even though minorities were treated differently, again, they were able to have an impact within the United States and within the United States military during this time. All right, so inhumane treatment during World War II. You're going to see that the conduct of war often reflects the social and moral codes of a nation. So basically what that means is if you are treating people very poorly during wartime, for example, you capture POWs and you just kill them versus giving them putting them in jail and eventually giving them the ability to be able to get out. That reflects a lot of you as a country and what your social and moral codes are as a nation. The treatment of POWs often reflected the savage nature of the conflict and the cultural norms of the nation. You're going to see with the Japanese that part of their social codes, we talked about how the Japanese did not, they viewed surrender as being very, very dishonorable. So because of that, they treated POWs very, very poorly during the war because they viewed them as very dishonorable people for surrendering. And specific groups, which may often be the object of hatred and prejudice. Again, if it's a group that's already within that category, that people already kind of hate on them, you're going to see that that's going to be amped up during this wartime, and they are going to face more discrimination. So, for a perfect example, the Jews over in Germany, a lot of people already looked at them very without a lot of trust. And once Hitler comes on the scene, he's very easily able to pin a lot of blame on the Jews because it was a group that people already had a lot of distrust for during that time. So the Geneva Convention would be established during World War II, and the purpose of that was to attempt to ensure the humane treatment of POWs by establishing rules to be followed by all nations. Now, again, not all nations followed these. Some nations did follow them, and I think in the case of Germany, in regards to the U.S., generally they follow the Geneva Convention, but when you look at Soviet troops, they did not follow the Geneva Convention when Germany was dealing with Soviet troops, and vice versa. Those two sides hated each other and did not really care for the Geneva Convention at all there. So again, the Geneva Convention is still in place today and still have the rules how we should treat other POWs during wartime. I have here, this is a CBS Sunday Morning story about Louis Zamperini. If you've ever seen the movie Unbroken or read the book, it tells about the story of Louis Zamperini. He has an absolutely incredible story from World War II, from being shot down over the Pacific, for floating around in the Pacific Ocean for it was almost 50 days, I believe, that they were floating around in the Pacific Ocean, then being captured by the Japanese and going through absolutely horrific treatment by the Japanese. But he has a pretty incredible story, a guy that was an Olympic athlete before World War II, and this really World War II and the experiences that he went through radically changed his life. So I encourage you to check that out, and I really encourage you to read the book Unbroken. It is a absolutely fantastic book. It's very, very thick, but it is such an easy read and so compelling. You'll be able to fly right through it, though. But check out his story there. So the Pacific Theater, you're going to see, again, the treatment of prisoners within the Pacific Theater reflected the savagery of the fighting there. And you're going to see the absolute worst treatment for POWs would be in the Pacific Theater. Again, the Japanese felt that it was very dishonorable to surrender, so they treated people that did surrender terribly. Most famously, you would see the Bataan Death March. In that, the Japanese would kill up to 650 Americans, 10,000 Filipinos. This would happen in the Philippines when they would march them on this long march. And again, they were treated very, very poorly in a lot of ways. If you ever have a chance to read some accounts from that, it's absolutely horrific, the treatment of American troops by the Japanese there and the Filipino troops as well. Japanese soldiers, of course, we talked about them, kamikaze, and how they would commit suicide rather than surrender. And again, that goes along with their whole code within their civilization. You can see the Bataan Death March there, and this long march that the troops were forced to go on, usually without food or water. So there's stories of during the Bataan Death March of people actually there being like mud puddles and troops being so thirsty that they would actually drink from the mud puddle. And then the kamikaze there, and in Japanese, what kamikaze means is God or divine wind. And again, it was seen as very honorable to Japanese to actually become a kamikaze and to kill yourself for the nation of Japan. All right, the European theater, you're going to see that POWs in Europe more closely followed the agreements of the Geneva Convention. This Western Union telegram here is actually letting a family here know in the States know that their family member had been captured by Germany and was being held as a POW. And this is reflected too after the war. You'll see some TV shows and that kind of thing come out. And usually if they dealt with prisoners of war, it was in the European front. You got a TV show like Hogan's Heroes, and then movies like The Great Escape that you would see that have to do with POWs in the European theater of the war. So again, in Europe, generally, again, that's not always the case. I know during the Battle of the Bulge, you would have an incident there where the Germans would kill a bunch, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, of American troops during the Battle of the Bulge. So that didn't always happen, but generally it was. Now, this right here is a scene from the miniseries Band of Brothers, and it is Americans liberating a concentration camp. And when we talk about concentration camps, you're going to realize that Most Americans had no clue about concentration camps and what was actually happening within Germany during this time. And even the leaders that kind of knew what was going on, they didn't realize to what extent and how bad things were that were really, really happening over there. So Band of Brothers here did a fantastic job of showing American troops entering into a concentration camps and just kind of being like bewildered and trying to figure out what in the world this concentration camp actually was. So I encourage you to check that out. I do think this scene, it actually cut off part of the beginning of it when you have one of the American troops who goes to get his superior officer, and the superior officer says, "What do you find? What did you find?" And he goes, I don't know what we just found. So again, a lot of confusion, and there's going to be a lot of anger too in American troops when they walk in and see the inside of these concentration camps. So, of course, Hitler over in Europe, he decides he wants to create the master race through what he knew as his final solution. If you didn't meet his qualifications, that meant that you could be destroyed, and especially for Jews. Again, but this covered a broad group of people, not just Jews, but Jews would make up the majority of that. In fact, this poster right here is advocating the killing of people with special needs because of how much they cost the nation of Germany over their lifetime. So groups targeted, again, Jews, Poles. You're going to have a lot of Polish Jews, and that's part of the reason they were targeted. Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and the physically handicapped. Hitler also went after specific religious groups that he didn't like Jehovah's Witnesses, and those as well. So these would be groups targeted by him. Also, you would have people that politically did not agree with him, who would also be targeted as well with this. And again, you'll see this road is very, very slippery path. Is basically it starts with, we're going to go after the Jews because they're responsible. And Jews, you have to register, and telling Germans not to support Jewish-owned businesses. So the road to a concentration camp, it started with that, and then things quickly escalated within Germany to, hey, not only are we not going to go to Jewish-owned businesses, but Jewish people now have to come live in these prison camps, which of course would become concentration camps. And a lot of people are just astonished that this would be able to happen in history. How did we as the world get to this point? And a lot of it, you could say, has to do with indoctrination of people. Yes, there were a lot of adults who willingly engaged in this, but you think about kids who were indoctrinated into the system as children. This is a Nazi children's book from 1936, and in it, the kids are reading, and what they're reading, it says, Jews are our misfortune and how the Jew cheats. So you're teaching children that Jews are misfortune upon society and that they cheat. Here's another one teaching children that the Jewish nose is crooked. It looks like a 6. And so that's with children. You also see it in the movies there. Probably the most famous of the Nazi films during this time would be The Eternal Jew. This poster right here is warning about East European subhumans. So again, looking at those Poles and those other groups they didn't like in Eastern Europe and calling them, basically saying they're not humans. And one thing that the Nazis did extensively also during the Holocaust is medical experiments. They did those quite extensively, and probably the only positive thing to come out of these medical experiments is that since we do not test on human beings, a lot of the information that the Nazis deemed from this, we were able to put to good use after it. Now, again, we don't condone this kind of thing happening and doing medical experiments on human beings. But yeah, medical experiments is one of the things they did big time. Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was known as the Angel of Death, he did a lot of medical experiments on children, especially twins, in the concentration camps. And again, if you want to find out more about the Holocaust, I recommend visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Usually you have to reserve your ticket early to get in there, but it is a fantastic, very sobering, very sad museum, but really it helps you to kind of grasp. It's hard when we look at these numbers we're about to look at and think about the massive amount of death that happened within Germany and those areas during the Holocaust. But really, it helps you to get a better understanding of that, but also to look to the future and hopefully that we can see the warning signs and never have that happen again. You can see the death numbers here. some of them that really stick out to me is look in Poland. The war Jewish population, 3.25 million, and the high estimate for deaths during World War II is 3 million Polish Jews. That is absolutely astonishing, the high number killed during that time. With that. So this next one again shows the Holocaust deaths overall. You can see here on the left how Jews, the percentage, they made up a good portion of that. I mentioned how the Germans did not treat the Soviet prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention. And you can see 20% of Holocaust deaths were these Soviet prisoners during this time. The politicals, those would be the people that disagreed with Hitler, 10%. And you can see the number from there. Again, more pictures from the Holocaust. I'm sure you've probably seen these before, again, just to help you understand the massive level of death during that time. So after the war, there would be a question of how do we punish the Nazi leaders for this? How do you prosecute, as this question says, unprecedented crimes like this? The decision is made in Nuremberg, Germany, to have hold the Nuremberg trials. Now, Nuremberg was a kind of a symbolic place because that's where Hitler had held a lot of his rallies. And that's considered like the headquarters of the Nazi Party there in Nuremberg. So again, you could say there was some symbolism holding the trial for these leaders in this place that had formerly been a place of symbolism for the Nazi Party there. So Nazi leaders and others were convicted of war crimes, and the trials would lead to the following. First of all, it would emphasize the individual responsibility for actions during a war, regardless of the orders received. So if you're in war and you were told to do something horrific, kill children or whatever it might be, that you can be held responsible for that, even though it's an order, that you should have a moral compass and say, no, I'm not, I refuse to do that because it's unethical for me to do that. Also, you'd see as a result of the Nuremberg trials, increased demand for a Jewish homeland, which would eventually become Israel, which would be created after World War II and after what had happened to the Jews there. And you will see with these Nuremberg trials that you would have a lot of these former Nazi officials who would be executed and would be jailed. And even through today, within the past 5 years, I've seen several stories about people that were former Nazis that have been found here in the United States or over in Europe and other places that have actually been taken back to Germany and put on trial for their participation in World War II. So even today, we're 70 plus years out from World War II. They are still actively looking for and hunting down a lot of these Nazi leaders. Even now, they're advanced in age, but people still want justice for all these millions and millions of people that were killed as a result of the Holocaust. So again, today, kind of a very sobering day, talking about how people were treated and minorities here during the war. Next class, we're going to jump in to the war here at home. I encourage you with anything that we have talked about today. There are so many resources out there for you to research and read about in movies about the Holocaust, about the role of minorities here in the United States during World War II. So I encourage you to jump in and to check those out if anything today, kind of stuck out or interested you in a big way. So I hope you have a great